I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Since the government's special party room meeting yesterday, has the Prime Minister sought a meeting with the LGBTI community to seek their views on the decision taken yesterday? Will the Prime Minister undertake to meet with representatives of the LGBTI community to hear their concerns before he resubmits his plebiscite legislation to the Senate, or does he think their opinion unimportant?
Members on my right, Leader of the House, Treasurer. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My government is committed to getting all Australians' views. My government is committed to giving every Australian a say. My government is committed to standing by the commitment it made at the election to give every Australian a say. And the only reason, Mr Speaker, that every Australian has not had their say on this issue is because of the opposition of the Labor Party in the Senate. That's the truth. That's the fact. They, throughout the election campaign, Mr Speaker, when we said again and again we will give every Australian a say on this, when we said we will not facilitate a bill, a private member's bill, on same-sex marriage in the House until all Australians have had their say and indicated their support. When we made that commitment, Mr Speaker, when we made that commitment, what did the Labor Party say? They slipped and slid. The only public statement the Leader of the Opposition had made was to the Australian Christian lobby in 2013 when he said he would support a plebiscite so that every Australian had a say. So he, as usual, Mr Speaker, as usual, telling people what they wanted to hear, as he always does, as he always does. And then after the election, he opposed the plebiscite. He'll have an opportunity to vote for it, to have his senators vote for it this week. And if they do not support it, then we will hold a postal vote and every Australian will have their say on this issue. And if the answer is yes, we'll facilitate a private member's bill. If it's no, we will not. We are standing by our commitment. The Leader of the Opposition says one thing one day and another the next. He tells every audience what it wants to hear. There is no consistency, no integrity, no respect for the Australian people.
The members on both sides will cease interjecting. The member for Bruce made an unparliamentary remark. He'll withdraw. And he'll now withdraw from the chamber under 94A. The member for PETRIE.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on last week's counter-terrorism operation to disrupt a plot to bring down an airplane? What steps is the government taking to keep all Australians safe, including in my electorate of PETRIE?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr Speaker, last week the Joint Counter-Terrorism Team in New South Wales, including the AFP, Australian Federal Police, the New South Wales Police and ASIO, disrupted one of the biggest terrorist plots in our history and contained it. And they were able to do so, as Deputy Commissioner Mike Phelan said last week, because of the laws that this parliament has given them to enable them to do that work. We have ensured that whenever our security agencies need additional legislative support or resources, we give it to them. There is no place for set and forget. The work that they did was remarkable. Mr Speaker, 2 individuals have been charged with terrorism offences, attracting a maximum sentence of life imprisonment, and they relate to an aborted attempt on the 15th of July to take an improvised explosive device, that is a bomb, onto an Etihad flight departing Sydney for the Middle East, and the intent to build an improvised chemical dispersal device which would, had it been completed, been able to disperse poisonous gas. Now, Mr Speaker, had this plot been successful, the consequences would have been catastrophic. Hundreds of deaths, lives ended, lives changed forever. And this plot was directed by Daesh, ISIL, from Syria. Now, these are cowards in the Middle East radicalising and directing people in Australia to kill in the name of their mad, demonic, deathly, Islamist, terrorist ideology. This is a real threat, Mr Speaker. This terrorist threat is very real and very close. And it reminds us, Mr Speaker, of the point that I've made repeatedly, that in the internet age, nowhere is far away from anywhere else. So it will be alleged by police that in the course of these proceedings that these conspirators were being directed from the Middle East as though their controller was across the street. It's a sober reminder of the challenges we face. Now, what we have done is we've put additional security measures were put in place at Sydney Airport immediately on the Thursday prior to the raids. These were extended to all major airports around the country. We have the terrorist threat level to aviation was raised. It has now been restored to its pre-existing level, but continued stronger protections will be in place at our airports. There is no room for complacency, no room for set and forget. Our agencies are the best in the world, and we are working to ensure that they remain so, keeping Australians safe.
The member for Sydney.
Mr Speaker, very briefly on indulgence, can I associate the opposition with the Prime Minister's remarks, congratulate our security and intelligence organisations on the work they've done in this instance and the work they do every day to keep Australians safe. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the Prime Minister's postal plebiscite on marriage equality. Why is it that a no vote will be binding on the government but a yes vote will not?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, the commitment we took to the election was simply this, that we would give all Australians their say if they supported same-sex marriage being legalised. We would facilitate a bill, a private member's bill, coming forward into the parliament. If they did not support it, we would not. That was the commitment we took to the election, and that's what we are endeavouring to deliver. The opposition has the opportunity to vote for the plebiscite bill this week in the House. If they don't, there will be a postal vote and every Australian will have their say.
Members will cease interjecting on both sides. The member for Ballarat and the member for Wakefield and Barker won't commence their normal interchange across the chamber, otherwise they'll be doing it outside very shortly. The member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Immigration and Border Protection. Will the Minister update the House on the benefits of a well-managed national security agenda, including for my electorate of Dunkley? What steps is the government taking to strengthen the requirements for Australian citizenship?
The Minister for Immigration and Border Protection.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for his question. Like all Australians, certainly people represented by all of my colleagues on both sides, I want to see whatever effort is possible to defeat the scourge of terrorism. We know that the threat of terrorism is real. I think in some parts of the country at the moment there is some complacency about the threat as it is manifesting, particularly with foreign fighters as they're returning from overseas. But it's not only that. As we're seeing in Victoria, we have gang violence issues where people who are going out on a Saturday night want to enjoy time with their families and face the scourge of that local crime. Now, the want of the Australian government, and as announced by the Prime Minister a couple of weeks ago in setting up the Home Affairs portfolio, is to make sure that all of our intelligence and crime-fighting agencies are working as effectively together as possible. It means that we do want to, Mr Speaker, make sure that the agencies have a proper sharing of information and intelligence where it's appropriate to do so, and that means that we need to work more effectively as we are now, but even more effectively with our state colleagues as well. It means that we need to recognise the threats as they're presenting in our community, because through the work that we've done, for example, Mr Speaker, around the cancellation of visas of criminals in our country, people that have done the wrong thing against Australians, we have made this country a safer place. The work that we're doing, and I pay full tribute to the Minister for Justice, the Attorney-General, all of the agencies, including the Australian Federal Police and ASIO, for the work that they've done in averting that crisis in Sydney in the last fortnight. We've also, Mr Speaker, been able to, through a tough border protection policy, bring about a higher level of national security, because if you can't secure your borders, you cannot secure the nation's security. And that has been demonstrated over the course of the last several years, and it was demonstrated by this government when we restored integrity to our borders. Under Labor, tragically, 1,200 people had drowned at sea, 50,000 people arrived on 800 boats, and, Mr Speaker, you cannot have a situation where that prevails. We have, in announcing our recent citizenship law changes, said to Australians that we want to make sure that we can have people becoming Australian citizens, as the vast majority of people currently do, who abide by Australian laws, who abide by Australian values and are able to integrate into Australian society. At one stage, the Leader of the Opposition believed in that. At one stage, he said he supported this. But you know what happens? And if you want to have a look at the track record of the Labor Party and of this Leader of the Opposition, who is duplicitous and hops around, he tells people what they want to hear at one audience, something different at the next audience. The Australian public have worked this bloke out, Mr Speaker. This bloke is the greatest fraud that has been in this chamber since Federation. That's the reality of this Leader of the Opposition, and this government will stand up for national security.
The Minister's
we need your
time has
support.
concluded. Members on both sides. The member for Chifley, the Leader of the Opposition, has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to this disgusting pamphlet authorised by a former Liberal minister, which falsely claims children of gay couples are more likely to abuse drugs, have sexually transmitted diseases and be unemployed. How does this fit with the Prime Minister's guarantee today of respectful discussion? Why is the Prime Minister making Australians pay $122 million to give licence to this vile rubbish?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I refer to my earlier answer. We gave a commitment in the election to give every Australian their say. And I'd say this, Mr
Members
Speaker,
on my left.
one of the big
Lindsay.
differences between our side of politics and Labor, at least as it's represented today, is that we respect the good sense of the Australian people. We know that they're perfectly capable of having a respectful discussion and debate. We're not going to shut down democracy and debate because people here or there say outrageous things or defamatory things. We have a robust democracy. We respect Australians' ability to have a frank and forthright discussion on this issue, but above all, we respect them so much that when we say we will give them their say, we are doing everything we can to ensure that they have their say.
Just before I call the member for Melbourne, members will cease interjecting. I'd like to inform the House that we have present in the Speaker's Gallery this afternoon a visiting delegation from the Parliament of Bangladesh, led by Dr Dipu Moni, MP, Chair of the Bangladesh Parliamentary Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. And we also have present in the gallery this afternoon the Northern Territory Minister for Primary Industry and Resources, the Honourable Ken Vowles, MLA. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you too. The member for Melbourne has the call.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. People's lives are being broken in immigration detention, and yesterday another asylum seeker died on Manus Island. Prime Minister, was Donald Trump right when he said that you are worse than he is?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his questions, and we all regret the death the honourable member referred to of the person detained in PMG. Mr Speaker, the position is very straightforward. We stand for the integrity of Australia's borders. We are not going to do what the Labor Party did with the support of the Greens and would do again, which is outsource our borders to people smugglers. We know what that looks like. There is a very straightforward analysis of this. We don't have to theorise, we don't have to speculate. This is not a subject for academic dissertation. We know right here in this place, Kevin Rudd defended weakening John Howard's border protection policies because he believed that it didn't matter what our policies were. He believed it was just the push factors. That was his theory. That was his theory. Well, he had the opportunity to test it out. 1,200 people at least died at sea, 50,000 unauthorised arrivals. We are not going to outsource our borders to people smugglers ever again. We will defend the integrity of our borders and, Mr Speaker, the confidence of the Australian people that their government and their government alone determines who comes into Australia enables us to have a generous humanitarian program, one of the most generous in the world, and is the foundation of our multicultural society. Strong borders means a strong society. That's what we stand for. We know what Labor and the Greens stand for. They stand for outsourcing our border protection to criminals and people smugglers.
Just before I call the member for North Sydney, we've also just had join us in the gallery this afternoon the 16th Australian Political Exchange Council delegation from Japan. On behalf of all members, I extend a warm welcome to you. And also a visiting delegation from the Parliament of Myanmar. On behalf of the House, I extend a very warm welcome to you. The member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Justice and Minister assisting the Prime Minister for Counter-Terrorism. Will the Minister update the House on the recent disruption of the Sydney terrorist plot? What action is the government taking to protect Australians from terrorism?
The Minister for Justice has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for North Sydney for that question. Now, last week our authorities disrupted what was perhaps the most sophisticated and advanced terrorism plot that we've ever had the misfortune to see on our soil. And Australians were the target of an ISIL-directed plot to kill Australians with improvised devices. Now, throughout this operation, 6 search warrants were executed in Sydney, and as a result 4 people were taken into custody under powers within the Crimes Act that allow police to thoroughly investigate these crimes. And as the Prime Minister noted, subsequent to that, 2 people have been charged with terrorism offences. These offences attract a maximum penalty of life behind bars. Now, this operation is a stark reminder that the threat from terrorism remains very real. Our agencies must deal with the full spectrum of threats, from low-capability single-actor attacks to sophisticated and advanced plots. I commend the work of the Australian Federal Police and ASIO, working in conjunction with New South Wales Police and other law enforcement and intelligence partners in disrupting this plot. If not for the tireless work of our agencies, the outcome of this could have been very different and it would have been catastrophic. And we should make no mistake that our agencies have stopped an atrocity from occurring. The Coalition Government has worked with these agencies to give them what they need to address the deteriorating national security environment, including an investment of $1.5 billion extra to support their efforts. We've also passed 8 tranches of legislation through the Parliament, which give them unprecedented powers, many of which powers were actually used during this operation. We continue to make sure that we have the right settings in Australia, and this operation reminds us that we are protected by amongst the best law enforcement and security agencies in the world. And of course, it's not just in the field of counter-terrorism that these agencies are striving to keep us safe and secure. I'm very pleased to confirm to the House that today in Sydney, the Australian Federal Police have undertaken significant operational activity, including the execution of 15 separate search warrants. Some of these relate to ongoing AFP investigations and some relate to joint agency investigations. 15 arrests have been made, with the seizure of more than 1.9 million tonnes of drugs, destined for Australian streets with a street value of over $800 million. This smashes a major international drug and organised crime syndicate and sends a clear message that we will not tolerate those trying to exploit our laws for their own gain. And I'm particularly pleased that the AFP have smashed a syndicate where the members have been very well known to law enforcement for a very long period of time and have had very high profiles, including flaunting their ill-gotten wealth. And we have shown today that nobody is above the law. I again congratulate the AFP and their partners for all that they've done to keep us safe over the past fortnight.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. AUSTRAC is taking legal action against the Commonwealth Bank for breaching Australia's anti-money laundering laws in over 53,000 separate transactions. How many more scandals will it take before the Prime Minister finally supports Labor's call for a royal commission into the banks?
The Prime Minister has
to say more about this, but I would just remind the Leader of the Opposition that AUSTRAC has commenced legal proceedings. It has done its job, and any
members on my left.
Were there to be any inquiry held into that of the kind the honourable member suggests, it would mean delaying or staying the legal proceedings. So AUSTRAC is on the case, doing its job. It's uncovered the wrongdoing and it's pursuing it. But I'll ask the Treasurer to say more about this.
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to respond. The matter that AUSTRAC is pursuing in the courts with the Commonwealth Bank of Australia is very, very serious, and that matter should be properly pursued through the courts. I was briefed on this matter on Monday by AUSTRAC in detail, and immediately I requested the Chairman of the Commonwealth Bank to meet with me, and I met with her earlier today to discuss the very serious issues with the Commonwealth Bank. At the same time, I've been taking advice from the key agencies and have spoken both to APRA and to ASIC in relation to these issues, as well as taking advice from Treasury. I've made it very clear to the Commonwealth Bank that in relation to these matters, the government's response is prepared to consider all options, and that remains our view.
The member for Grey has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the government is delivering on its commitment to secure better days ahead for Australian families and businesses? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Grey for his question and his interest, like all members on this side of the House, in the economics of opportunity, Mr Speaker, because on that side all we see are the politics of envy. When it comes to those opposite, they think the only way you can do better is if you make someone else do worse, Mr Speaker. This may be what the Leader of the Opposition thinks is a seductive pill for the Australian people, Mr Speaker, but it is a very poisonous pill for the Australian economy. What the Australian government is doing, Mr Speaker, is getting on with the job. Since we were elected last year, we have passed 126 separate pieces of legislation implementing the agenda of the Turnbull government. Tax cuts for small businesses, cracking down on multinationals, ensuring that childcare is more affordable, ensuring that the rule of law returns to building sites around this country. Education funding at record levels is passed, and as the Minister for Justice has just said, important counter-terrorism laws passing through this parliament, the Turnbull government getting on with the job. But in addition to that, 17 separate pieces of budget legislation passed in the budget sittings, and that means the budget is passing this parliament despite the frustration and opposition and negativity and cynicism of the Leader of the Opposition, the most slippery customer ever to occupy that chair, Mr Speaker. Now, the better days ahead, Mr Speaker, are already starting to be evidence. At the beginning of this year, the Leader of the Opposition said that this year was going to be all about jobs. Well, he's asked one question about jobs back in February, and today he's asking questions about marriage, Mr Speaker. His priorities are on display. On this side of the House, we're talking about jobs, national security, keeping Australians safe, ensuring that the economics of opportunity reigns in the Australian economy. But nothing more than the politics of envy keeps gripping the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, and taking him down a very dark and dangerous path if the Australian people were ever to trust him. 168,000 people have got a job in this country this calendar year alone since that Leader of the Opposition said this year was all about jobs. Well, there's 168,000 jobs in this country, which is a testimony to the economic policies of this government. 99% of those jobs this calendar year are full-time jobs too, Mr Speaker. If you go back over the last fiscal year, over 240,000 jobs created, the single largest increase, Mr Speaker, growth in jobs in a fiscal year since before the global financial crisis. On top of that, Mr Speaker, over 177,000 jobs are out there advertised today. This government is getting on with the job. That opposition is all about envy.
The member for Griffith.
Yes, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Does the Treasurer consider that inequality in Australia is getting better or worse?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can only quote the head of the Melbourne Institute responsible for the Hilda data, which demonstrates, Mr Speaker, that it is true that household incomes have been flat in this country, as the Hilda survey sets out. And that remains a very serious concern for the government, and that is why the government is taking the actions that I just outlined to grow the opportunity in this economy for people to get jobs and earn more wages. Now, you cannot boost someone's wages, Mr Speaker, by reducing someone else's. That's the Leader of the Opposition's plan. He talks about redistribution of income. Well, Australians should be very clear what he wants to do. The Leader of the Opposition wants to do is redistribute the income you have earned back to the government, Mr Speaker, to spend willy-nilly, as Labor governments always do. The other thing we should bear in mind, Mr Speaker, was when you look at household incomes, after you take into account tax and transfers of welfare payments, both of these systems, a progressive tax system and a welfare system that provides a safety net, is intended to protect against rising inequality. And as the Hilda data definitely demonstrated and was observed, Mr Speaker, since the global financial crisis, our tax and transfer system has protected against rising inequality, Mr Speaker. They are the facts. But the question for Australians is this. We know that household incomes are flat, so there is a question. Are you going to have your income raised? Are you going to have your wages increased by the Leader of the Opposition taxing Australia out of business and taxing Australians out of jobs? Or are you going to have your incomes lifted? Because that's what matters. If someone else's incomes go down, that doesn't mean yours goes up. And so, with a government focused on growing the economy, that is how people's wages increase. Those opposite simply want to let taxes rip and tax Australia out of business and tax Australians out of a job.
The member for Robertson has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services. Will the minister update the House on how the government's business tax cuts will benefit all hard-working Australians? And is the minister aware of any alternative approaches that pose a threat to Australian businesses, including and especially to the 15,000 hard-working small businesses in my electorate of Robertson?
Member for Perth is warned. He's been interjecting all through question time. The minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Robertson for her question, and she is a wonderful advocate in this place for the more than 15,000 small and medium-sized enterprises in her local community. Just like the member for Robertson, the government is firmly focused on getting our economic and taxation settings right for those small and medium-sized enterprises. We want to make sure that we can grow our economy, boost Australian jobs and increase Australian wages. We know that a strong economy means strong jobs, and that those strong jobs means more opportunity for all Australians, including for the member for Robinson in her local community. That is why this government has reduced taxation for small and medium-sized businesses. After all, small businesses represent 97% of all business in this country, and they employ more than 6.5 million Australians. That's about half of the workforce here in Australia. We have cut the company tax rate to 27.5% for these businesses with a turnover of less than $25 million. And we plan to reduce this further to 25%. By contrast, those opposite will raise taxes on those entrepreneurial Australian businesses that employ all of those Australians I mentioned before. Those small businesses with a turnover of between $2 million to $25 million will see their tax hiked to 30%. That is more than 100,000 small businesses employing more than 2.2 million Australians in this turnover bracket. They will lose out under Labor. Not only will they see their taxes increase, but those small businesses with a turnover of between $2 million and up to $10 million will also lose access to such concessions as the instant asset write-off. On top of this, we hear more recently that those opposite are going to slug these small, hard-working businesses even further with their new trust policy. 270,000 Australian small businesses will be slugged more by those opposite. Labor has not one policy to grow the economy, not one policy to create a job, not one policy to increase Australian wages. They have just one big policy to increase taxes on hard-working Australians. Shame on them.
Just before I call the member for McMahon, I'd also like to welcome to the gallery the former Premier of South Australia, the Honourable Dean Brown, who's joined us today. On behalf of the House, extend a very warm welcome. And I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can the government seriously claim that inequality isn't a problem when, under the Prime Minister's current tax policy, an investment banker on the top marginal rate can use their family trust to pay zero tax on some of their income, while a nurse or a teacher has to pay their full marginal tax rate on all their income?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I'm sure in the days when the Leader of the Opposition spent his time sucking up to Richard Pratt, he would have been making all these points. He would have been down there at Raheen saying, "Oh, this, you're doing too well, Dick. You've got to pay a bit more tax." That's what he would have said. Can you imagine? Can you imagine this social mountaineer? He was there sucking up to the billionaires of Melbourne, and now he wants to proclaim himself as the champion of the poor and oppressed. Mr Speaker, it wasn't so long ago. It wasn't so long ago that he was going around talking about the virtues of trusts. In fact, when he was the Minister for Revenue, the Assistant Treasurer in 2011, he used to go from one financial planning conference to another, talking about how he loved trusts and how useful they were and how important they were for small business. It was a bit like
Member
the
for
ACL
Griffith will
meeting,
leave under 94A.
always telling people what they want to hear. And now he's decided that he wants to be an Australian version of Jeremy Corbyn. Well, let me tell you, mate, you haven't got what it takes. You haven't got what it takes to be Jeremy Corbyn. You need to do a bigger makeover than you've done already. Mr Speaker, the reality is this. The reality is this, as we know, that we have in Australia relatively high minimum wages compared to many other countries, and we have a means-tested welfare system. And for the reasons Dr. Lee, the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, has written in his work over the years, that is why income inequality, household income inequality, is less marked in Australia than it is in the United States or the United Kingdom. It is why, for example, Mr. Speaker, that when the Leader of the Opposition gave his speech at the Melbourne Institute, he was quickly denounced by none other than Professor Roger Wilkins, the author of the Hilda's Economic and Social Outlook Conference. He said a narrative that says inequality is ever rising, this is Professor Wilkins, is patently false from the available evidence that we have. Now, of course, this clearly shocked that distinguished academic, but it didn't shock any of us, because, Mr. Speaker, we know that the way to address low wages and slow growth is to support growth and investment. That's what we're doing. Labor has not got a single policy that would support economic growth. In fact, when put on the rack by the redoubtable Fran Kelly on Radio National on this very point, all he could do was stumble and bumble and say, we like public transport. Well, I tell you what, Mr.
Prime
Speaker,
Minister's
under
time
a short
has concluded. The member for Maranoa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Agriculture and Water Resources. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House steps the government is taking to grow the economy through investments in the agricultural sector? Is he aware of any barriers to unlocking the potential of agriculture?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and Northern Australia and mining as well now. Mr. Speaker, it is without a shadow of a doubt that we are laying down the plans of how we are going to further develop the agricultural resources of Australia, especially with vital infrastructure. And one of the most pertinent of those vital infrastructure is the inland rail. With $8.4 billion, $8,400 million, they'll be allocated to the construction of this vital piece of infrastructure, which is a railway line that will go from Melbourne through the inland, through Seymour, Wodonga, up to Parkes, from Parkes to places such as Narrabri, to Moree, near Gundawindi, not too Gundawindi, Toowoomba, and this is going to create the mechanism to drive the commerce of those areas ahead, to create the capacity that America has created in the past with places such as Fort Worth, to give real prospect of economic growth on the western side of the range. Now, Mr. Speaker, we look to the Labor Party to see what their views on this. We really do. We look for the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, and long may he remain so, the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure. About the best we can get is they think it's a good idea. A good idea. A good idea. We can't get them to commit. We can't get them to commit to a vision for our nation. A vision for our nation, for regional Australia. Now, they can come to the dispatch box, I say to the honourable member for Maranoa, they can come to the dispatch box and say that they are committed to the inland rail, they'll put money on the table, that they share the same vision, but they don't. And we see the same with the Regional Investment Corporation. We are setting up a $4 billion institution, a $4 billion bank, in the member for Calare seat in Orange, a member for Calare seat. And what are the Labor Party going to do? Well, they're going to get rid of it. They're going to get rid of it. That is what they are going to do for regional Australia. Or then we can go to dams. We are going to construct dams. We have put $2.5 billion in both grants and loans on the table for dams. And what are the Labor Party going to do? Well, they're going to take money out of it. They can't find the money, so they're going to take $235.2 million out so that we can destroy the dreams for people like the member for Capricornia or the member for Flynn. We can destroy their dreams by not building Rookwood Weir, because we know that the Labor Party are owned by the Greens. They are owned by the Greens. They have given up on the agricultural sector. They've given up on the mining sector. They don't believe in labourers anymore. The Labor Party have given up on labourers. They do not have the fortitude to stand up to the Greens and build the inland rail. Why? Because they are going to put frogs before people. They are the party that will put frogs before people. They do not have a vision for this nation. They do not have a vision for the future. They have not laid down one plan for agriculture. They put possums before people in the timber industry. They put frogs before people in building dams. They do not believe in the future of Australia. So I challenge the member for Maribyrnong to come to the dispatch box and say what you're going to build in regional Australia.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister stand by his statement in 2005 that, and I quote, "There are structural aspects of our tax system which enable people to reduce the overall amount of tax they pay. Trusts are one. How is it fair that high-income earners can reduce the amount of tax they pay through trusts, but normal wage earners simply cannot?"
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I do not claim to be an expert in the use of trusts. I don't have a family trust, so I can say I personally I am not very good at tax avoidance. I've paid a lot of tax, and I've done so gladly. I'm not an expert in this area, but I'd say, Mr Speaker, being very serious about this, the reality is that trusts are used largely by small and medium businesses, overwhelmingly, and the honourable members know that. And indeed, I'd quote the Leader of the Opposition when he was the Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Financial Services in 2011. And this is what he said. He was the minister, responsible minister. He had all of the advice. He knew all about it. He knew a lot more about this area than I do, that's for sure. And this is what he said. He was against a proposal to have trust tax-like industry at the company rate because, and this is his words, not mine, because it could see thousands and thousands of family businesses pay far more tax than they are at present. And then, the month before, in a speech to the Taxation Institute of Australia in Brisbane, the then Assistant Treasurer, the member for Maribyrnong, said, "We don't believe trusts are any form of tax avoidance. We see trusts as a legitimate feature of how Australians conduct their financial affairs." Well, that was his position there. And, Mr Speaker, there are many other examples of that. But the reality is this. We have policies which are encouraging investment and employment. We have seen 240,000 jobs created in the last year. That jobs and growth is not a slogan, it's an outcome. It is an outcome. Now, what has the Labor Party got plans for? Higher income taxes, higher company tax, higher small business taxes, higher housing taxes, higher investment taxes. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party's policies are all of them designed to discourage investment and discourage employment. And I repeat, as I said in my earlier answer, when he was pressed on this by Fran Kelly as to what his policies were going to do for jobs, he stumbled and bumbled and proffered a great interest in public transport as the answer. Well, we all like catching the tram, I'd say to the Leader of the Opposition, but you've got to do a lot more than that if you want to create a 21st century economy.
The member for Fisher.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry, representing the Minister for Employment. What action is the government taking against officials of registered organisations who have been found to break the law? Is the minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fisher for his question. And sadly, I have to inform him that in the break, the CFMEU have broken another record. They have broken another record, Mr Speaker, this time following a $300,000 fine from the federal court. They've now passed the only union in Australia's history that's had $10 million worth of fines. $10 million worth of fines. I heard one member say that's not much from the Labor Party. That's not much. So $10 million of fines, Mr. Speaker. In the same time, since 2001, they've given $13 million worth of donations to the Labor Party. $13 million worth of donations, $10 million worth of fines, $23 million worth of the workers in the CFMEU's money that they were able to give away back to the federal government or to the Labor Party. So the leadership of the CFMEU thought $23 million of their workers' money was better off paying fines and donating to the Labor Party than leaving in the pockets of people who are members of the CFMEU. What a disgraceful union, Mr. Speaker. And it's disgraceful that the Labor Party would think it was a good idea to keep taking money from the CFMEU. And what was the great cause, Mr. Speaker, for which these fines were incurred in Queensland? Well, the great cause was disrupting work on the Queensland Children's Hospital, and wait for it, Ronald McDonald House. So all those families from rural and regional Australia who went to Brisbane to stay with their sick children at the Children's Hospital, the CFMEU thought it was a good idea to disrupt building on Ronald McDonald House and the Queensland Children's Hospital. Yes, they've gone very quiet. What an amoral union. What an amoral union is the CFMEU. But you know a person by the friends they keep. And their best friend in this place is the Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker. So if the Leader of the Opposition intends to remain their best friend, he has to wear the opprobrium. Why doesn't he show some backbone, Mr. Speaker? Show some spine, like Bob Hawke did. When Bob Hawke said about the CFMEU, I wouldn't tolerate it. You know what I did with the Builders Labourers Federation? I would throw them out. That's what Bob Hawke said about the CFMEU, because of course he threw out the BLF, but not this Leader of the Opposition. Not this Leader of the Opposition who can't, like an automaton, can't stop repeating the same thing because he's been stung. Because he's been stung. He supports a union that thinks it's a good idea to slow down work on Ronald McDonald's House and the Children's Hospital in Queensland. Shame on him.
The member for Moreton's warned. The Manager of Opposition Business has the call.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Water. I refer to the Four Corners allegations of water theft and corruption. Can the Deputy Prime Minister confirm that the inquiry to be conducted by the Murray-Darling Basin Authority cannot compel witnesses to appear, cannot take evidence under oath, cannot seize documents and cannot protect whistleblowers? Why won't the Deputy Prime Minister commit to a national judicial inquiry through COAG to ensure that the Murray-Darling Basin Plan is not undermined?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and also thank him, I think, for one of the first questions he's ever given me. So it's good that it's good. One of the first questions, one of the first he's ever given me. And might I say, right at this point in time, no one condones theft. Nobody condones theft. No one condones theft and never has. As I said, if a person is thieving something, it is like they are thieving anything else. If they're thieving a car, if they're thieving water, if they're thieving cattle, if they're thieving sheep, if they're a theft, they're a theft. But these are allegations. Be very, very careful. These are allegations. These are allegations and have not been proved. However, there is a lot of work now going into the investigation of the allegations. And might I remind the House that right now Ken Matthews, with the support of 3 people who have had experience in ICAC, that is police officers, are currently investigating precisely this. Precisely this. Precisely this. Might I also say to the House that Mr Hanlon has referred himself to ICAC right now on this issue. Might I also say to the House that we also have the auditor. We have the auditor also investigating this. Might I also say to the House that the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is conducting an independent review and investigation into this. All of these have the capacity, and ICAC in New South Wales does not need anybody to encourage them to expand their investigations if they need to do precisely that. Precisely that. And so we are taking this thing abundantly seriously, and we are pursuing this issue through to make sure that if someone has thieved something, that they will be found out. But right now, we always say you have to understand that these are allegations that have been put forward, and they are allegations that are being tested.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment and Energy. Will the minister update the House on how the government is prioritising a stable, secure and affordable energy supply which supports jobs for hard-working Australians? What hurdles stand in the way of providing a secure and affordable electricity supply to families and businesses in my electorate of Boothby and elsewhere?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question and acknowledge her deep concern about the rising energy prices and the impact it's having on people in her electorate from Mitcham to Marion. Now, the Turnbull government is taking action on a number of fronts. We're trying to drive down the price of gas by putting in place a mechanism which could potentially restrict exports. We've also put in place new regulation around the transportation of gas on pipelines from August the 1st, the most significant reforms in more than 2 decades. We're also taking action to stop energy companies gaming the system. That is why we took action to abolish the limited merits review process, was giving the network companies a free option and leading to billions of dollars of higher energy bills for Australians. And that is why the Labor Party have left it to us, because they didn't take any action when they were in government. And tomorrow the Prime Minister is speaking to the energy retailers, wanting to ensure that Australian households, particularly the most vulnerable Australian households, are getting the best possible market deal, not the more expensive standing offers. And we're also investing in new technology and innovation and Snowy Hydro 2.0, demand-side management, energy efficiency. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm asked, are there any obstacles to this approach? Well, we know under the Labor Party, when they were in office, electricity prices went up by more than 100%. And we know that they have an ideological commitment to a 50% renewable energy target and a 45% emissions reduction target. And we know that in the state of South Australia, we know what goes wrong when you pursue these green left policies. Indeed, they have the highest price and less stable system in the national energy market. Now, Mr Speaker, what is the inconvenient truth of South Australia's energy system? It's that they are now importing more than ever brown coal-fired power from Victoria. It's now that they have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars in building a new gas-fired generator. And it's now clearer than ever that they have to spend $110 million on diesel generators that don't work in warm temperatures, Mr Speaker. Diesel generators that don't work in warm temperatures. But I think the funniest impact of this green ideology is the fact that now Jay Weatherall is hiring collaborative conservationists, people who will door-knock 18,000 homes, spreading the gospel of green energy, which ultimately, in the case of South Australia and the Commonwealth and the Labor Party, only lead to higher prices.
The Prime Minister.
Yeah, thanks, Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.
I thank the Prime Minister.